Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Thank you for attending our eCounsel quarterly webinar. My name is Abby and I'm going to be your host. I am joined today by Betsy Lopez, who is one of our technical support engineers. She has over 20 years of experience in the industry, both in corporate, legal, and law firms. Betsy is also highly proficient in Mitratech's corporate legal, matter management, and electronic billing applications since she's joined the team in 2001. She also helps troubleshoot and resolve issues for clients and train users as necessary. I'm sure many of you are aware of the help that she has given, but before I turn it over to Betsy, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. We will be recording the webinar. We will hope to have it out early next week to those of you who registered for the webinar, as well as feel free to use the Q&A section of the webinar or WebEx should you have any questions. And if time does run out and we are not able to answer everyone's questions, we will follow up with you offline. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Betsy so that she can educate us on the workflow and Smart Invoice standard rules. Betsy, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be presenting to you the out-of-the-box functionality of the invoice routing workflow as it comes with eCounsel. I will also be covering the Smart Invoice standard rules, and these are rules that are free to the clients who purchase Smart Invoice, and I'll be covering each of the rules individually and kind of giving you an idea as to how they trigger and what kind of error messages you'll get and what they're looking for. So basically, we'll be going in this order. I'll be doing the routing workflow first, and then followed by the invoice audit rules, then the invoice validation rules, and then the workflow rules, and in the end, we'll talk about the scheduled tasks. So the first thing, basically, when you are getting ready to start your electronic billing, you would create your matters up front. And then the next step would be to create your approvers that are going to be authorized to approve invoices for those matters. So approvers basically are added in the people module with an employment record designating their dates of employment and approval authority. So they would have to have the date, and then of course they would have to be designated as approvers with an approval authority amount. Allocations are those chargeback codes that you would be designating to charge invoices back to your internal entities or to billing entities for the matters. And again, these two would also be created in the entities module as an allocation, and the chargeback information would be added on the entity base info with the chargeback information. Once these have been added here, then you have to consider the timekeepers that your vendors are going to bill with. So timekeepers can be added to eCounsel in two different ways. The first way, of course, is to use a timekeeper import template that the vendors would complete, and then you would use the timekeeper import wizard to electronically import the timekeepers without having to key them in each individually. The things to remember here are that the timekeeper import templates are designed to work with a wizard, and they cannot be modified in any way, form, or fashion. The columns that exist in that template have to stand as they are. They cannot be moved around. They cannot be relabeled. And no additional criteria can be added in other columns of the template. Otherwise, those templates will come in with errors. Another thing to remember also is that whenever you're opening up a template from a vendor, you need to open it up either with a notepad, because it is a CSV file, and if you open it up in Excel, it will delete any leading zeros in your timekeeper IDs, if there are any. Another way is we have a file that we can provide, and actually is on Customer Connect, that you can download that will show you how to open it up in Excel without having those leading zeros get deleted. So these are two things that really you need to keep in mind in order to use this option, because otherwise you'll be getting error messages. The other option, of course, is to add them manually to the people module, and you would include their timekeeper ID in the base info. And you would also add an employment record designating the dates of employment with the vendor, the billing method, right? And of course, the beginning dates are very important here because the rules, the invoice audit rules, will look at these dates to determine the valid record to validate against. When you get ready, when you finished inputting all your timekeepers, your allocations, and your approvers, then you're ready to add them to the matters as players. So to add approvers are added by creating a matter player record, and it includes a begin date that has to be before the dates of the invoices he or she is to approve. Okay? The approver designation, the approval amount, will automatically populate into the record as soon as you select the person. But the approval order is something that you would need to create or enter. And the approval order is how the order in which each approver will receive the invoices for approval. Normally you start at 1. If you leave it blank, forget to put it in there and you leave it blank, it's going to be read as a 0, and it will be automatically delivered to that person first. If you have multiple approvers with 0s, all of them will receive the invoices simultaneously, and there will not be a hierarchy order in which they approve. They can approve at any point in time as long as the invoice is in their queue. The allocations also need to be added to matters by creating a player record that also includes the begin date to be before the dates of the invoices to which the allocation will be applied. The chargeback section will be fully populated based on what was entered in the entity-based info. If you have multiple allocations assigned to the matter and they are all reading 100%, all of them will be added at 100% to the invoice. So this is something that you need to take into consideration also when you're adding the allocations to the matters. Invoice settings and configurations in Suite Manager, so that the approvers and the allocations will automatically be loaded to the invoices anytime an invoice comes into the system and gets attached to the matter. There are some configurations in Suite Manager that need to be performed. In Suite Manager, basically in the system settings, under the invoice settings option, there is this option to auto-load approvers and allocations from the Matter Players tab. If you have both of these checked, then when the invoices come into the system and they're accepted, they pass all the rules and everything, they will automatically load the approvers and the allocations from the Matter Player as you have them set. And so you don't have to go into the invoices to add them, they are automatically there. If you have a person that will be approving invoices over a specified amount, like a master approver, you may want to add that person here as well by checking this box, selecting them from the selection list, and then indicating when they are to receive the notification if the invoice is over a specified amount. Other things you need to configure in Suite Manager, of course, are the standard invoice audit, validation, and workflow rules. Now, all of these are optional. It all is contingent on how your internal business processes are defined and what type of validations you want to perform. All of them are available to you at any point in time if you want to use them. And I'm going to cover them today so you can kind of get an idea as to what they do, and maybe you can decide if you need them or not. They are optional. You don't have to validate invoices. You can let them in without any validations if you want. But all the rules are optional. The scheduled workflow tasks, and I'm going to talk to those in a little bit more. These tasks basically are the ones that are going to route your invoices to the approvers. So I'm talking about like the invoice routing task and the email notification task. Once you've set up all the configurations in Suite Manager and in your eCounsel matters, then you're ready to get the vendors to submit your invoices. So the vendors would submit the invoices in Corridor. There are some validations that occur there, but they have the option to skip over those validations and allow the invoice to come in here into eCounsel. Once it hits eCounsel, the Smart Invoice web task actually runs at a predetermined scheduled time to go to Corridor and pull in all those invoices that are awaiting that have been submitted by the vendors. The invoice audit rules trigger during the import process, and it validates the invoices based on the rules criteria. And each rule will trigger in order that you've actually loaded them onto the system. The rejection ones will trigger first, and then the warning ones will trigger second. If the invoices fail any of the rules criteria, the rules are set to rejection, and the invoices are rejected with an email notification to the vendor with the reason for the rejection. The administrator for the client will also receive the same notification. If it's set to warning, then the invoices are allowed into eCounsel with the warning message indicating the error with the invoice. And those error messages will appear in red on each of the individual line items to which they apply. If the rules criteria is met, then the invoice is allowed into eCounsel, and then the validation and the workflow rules trigger. And invoices will be accepted or rejected depending on if they meet those rules criteria. Now, when invoices are imported into eCounsel, all of the approvers and all of the allocations that are listed on the Matter Player tab, as long as they fall within the date range, are auto-loaded to the invoice from the Matter Player tab. They all appear on the invoice with the order number in which they are to receive the invoice. Even though they all appear on the invoice, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to see it in their invoices awaiting my approval widget until it actually gets routed to them. So when the invoice routing task triggers at its scheduled time, the invoices will first be routed to the approver on each invoice with the approval order of 1 or 0. And then it's placed on their invoices awaiting my approval widget on their home page. The approval email notification task also triggers at its scheduled time, and it's going to send an email notification to the approvers that includes a link to each individual invoice awaiting their approval. It will also give them a link to check that will take them to the list of all the invoices awaiting their approval so that they can batch approve if they want to do that. After the first approver approves the invoice, and when the invoice routing task triggers at its next scheduled time, it's then going to route the invoice to the second approver. And this process is going to continue from approver to approver until all the approvers have approved and or the invoice has been fully approved. When invoices have been fully approved, then the invoice administrator can post fully approved invoices by selecting the approved invoices filter in the invoice module. And they will all appear in the list, and to select all of them to batch post, they would just check the vendor, the box next to the vendor, and it'll check all of them at the same time. And then by clicking the post button, it will automatically post all the invoices at the same time. Once the invoices have been posted, then the AP integration task runs at its scheduled time, and all the invoices that have been posted will be exported for payment. Every field in every invoice is exported. We do not filter any data out. It is up to the AP department to decide what fields they want to import into their systems. So a file is actually placed onto a shared directory that they have access to. They come out there, they pull it in to their system. If they are going to return a file with payment information for those invoices, they will return it back to the same directory, and at the time the task runs the next time, it'll pick up that payment file at the same time it delivers the next batch of invoices to be paid. And then it'll upload all that payment information to the invoices, and then your invoice statuses will change from posted to paid. Now, the standard, that is the gist of the entire workflow process for the invoice routing process. That is out of the box. The only rules that are involved are the standard audit rules and the validation and workflow rules, and of course the tasks. And all those are part of the Smart Invoice package that you would get when you buy Smart Invoice. And so if you don't want to use a custom rule to do your invoice routing, this is the way that you would do it. Once you set your approvers and your timekeepers and your allocations and your matters, you really don't need to set them up again unless they change, at which time you would end date those existing ones and then just create new records for the new ones. Other than that, the routing process should flow pretty smoothly. I'm going to go through each of the standard rules and kind of give you just an idea as to what they do. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. The cost type is disbursement rule. Sometimes you want to know whenever vendors bill you for disbursements, a lot of clients don't want to get billed for disbursements, or they want them to come in as expenses so they can report on them better. So we have this rule that allows you to install on your system that will actually look for the word disbursement in the line item description. If it finds that word, it is going to either reject it depending on how you have the encryption level set. If you have it set to rejection, then it's going to reject the invoice with a notification saying line item number X is of a disbursement type. If it's set to warning, it'll come into the system with the warning message. And as you'll see here at the bottom of the screen, this is the warning message that you would see on the line item. The days between service start and service end date rule. Sometimes an invoice approver wants to know when an invoice is submitted that has a service begin and end date that exceeds the number of days that they've configured in the rule. Sometimes clients allow vendors to bill for 30 days at a time only. Others allow them 90 days. It's all, again, dependent on your internal business processes and what your requirements are. The rule has a parameter that you can configure to specify the number of days that you want to allow. This rule triggers when the lead file is imported and saved to eCounsel. It's going to check the number of days between the invoice start date and the service end date. And if it exceeds the number in your rule parameter, it will reject or warn, depending on your encryption level. And if it's going to come in and it'll have this message there in the invoice. And that is right underneath the comment on your summary page. It doesn't come in at the line item level. This one is at the invoice level. So it'll say the time between service start and end date exceeds X number of days. The duplicate line item check. Sometimes you want to know if there's more than one fee line item on an invoice for the same timekeeper on the same day for the same things. This rule triggers on import as well, and it checks each fee line item on the invoice to look for the same timekeeper with more than one line item with the same day per matter, on the same day per matter. If it finds it's going to either reject it or allow it in, depending, again, on your encryption levels. If the timekeeper field or line item date are empty or null, then it's not going to check that line for a duplicate. If you're using task-based billing, in other words, if you're requiring task codes to be used with your fee line items, it is going to look at the task code as well to determine if it is a duplicate. If the line item task code is empty, then that line item will not be checked. This is an example at the bottom, and it will say this line item may be a duplicate. It's expense code per unit. This is where you want to validate your expense codes and what they're charging you for. Expense codes and maximum number of units are configurable in the rule. So as an example here, the rule can be installed multiple times, one for each expense code. In this example, you can enter one for E105 for the telephone. If you're not going to allow them to bill you for telephone charges or for local travel, you can enter these codes in the rules and specify 0 as the amount that you'll allow. And then the invoice will be validated for these codes when the invoice comes into the system. And if there's a match found on the first 4 characters, then it's going to validate and make sure it doesn't exceed the maximum allowed. If you set it at 0, it's going to reject the invoice. If you'll notice here at the bottom, I have one that says line item 4 contains a charge for expense code E105 that is greater than 0 units. That means that you're not allowing them to bill you on that amount, and that invoice will get rejected. Expense code validation. We have 2 versions of this rule that you can use depending, again, on your requirements. Version 1.1 will allow expense codes into the system that match exactly the UTBMS code criteria. In other words, it will allow import of expense codes that contain the letter E and at least 3 numbers, like E105 or E105A. And the code has to exist in the expense code lookup list in Suite Manager. However, it will not allow codes, custom codes like EVAT or E1, even if they exist in the expense codes lookup list. So it validates for those codes, and if it's not matched with an existing expense code in eCounsel, then it's going to either reject or warn. And it will have a warning message similar to this one here, line item 3, line item expense code of E100 from the leads failed to import because the value is invalid. The second version of this expense code validation rule will allow any code to come into the system as long as it exists in your expense code list in eCounsel, which means it will allow the EVAT or E1. As long as the codes exist in the lookup list, then those codes will be allowed. And the reason we have 2 versions of this is because we've had multiple clients ask for one or the other. Some want real stringent validations, which would be version 1.1. Some want a little bit more lax, and they want to be able to use their own custom coding, so then they would use the 1.2. And the message would be similar. Now the expense rate, this will warn you or reject the invoice if the expense code has a rate that exceeds a rate specified in the rules parameter. This rule triggers when an invoice is submitted, and it checks at each expense line item and the codes therein to find a match with the rule parameter. And if it's found, then it checks the rate for the rule. If the rate is greater than the value in the rule parameter, then it's going to reject or warn depending on your criteria. And you'll get the error message that the expense code exceeds the allowed rate. Invoice amount minimum, basically what this does, it just validates. It allows you to specify a minimum amount that you'll allow the vendors to bill. Because it takes time to process invoices and all the overhead involved in processing invoices. A lot of clients don't want to process anything under $100. So they'll set the criteria for this rule to be $100. And anything that comes in at $100 or less, it will reject, saying that the invoice total is less than the specified minimum. The invoice date expired, basically, it just checks that the invoice date in the leads file is less than a certain number of days before the date of the invoice submission or the current system date. And that number of days is a configurable parameter in the rule. So if the invoice date in the leads file is greater than that number of days, then it will either warn or reject. And it'll say that the invoice date violates the X number of day expiration for the invoice audit. The invoice detail missing description, this is when you want to be warned when an invoice line item description is empty. Sometimes you receive leads files where they're submitting all the criteria except the detail of the line item. This rule will validate that detail, and if it's missing, it will reject or warn. Either way, it'll say the invoice line item does not contain a description. So, because you do want to know what they're billing you for. The invoice missing description, this is at the invoice level. Some clients use the invoice description field to have the vendors insert like the matter name, because the matter number is included on the leads file, but the matter name is not. So a lot of clients use the invoice description field for that purpose. If you want to make sure that they include that every time, then you would install this rule so that it validates the invoice description to make sure that it's not empty. And if it is, then it will reject or warn, saying that the invoice does not contain a description. The line item calculation rule is just checking the math for correctness of each of the detail line items. And basically what it does, it calculates the units times the rate plus a discount amount, and it must equal the adjusted billed amount, which is the total line item. If it doesn't, if the calculations don't equal, then it's going to issue a warning or rejection, and the message will be that there's a calculation issue, that the units times the rate plus a discount don't equal the adjusted billed amount pre-tax. The line item calculation with tax does the same thing, except this one also includes taxes. So if you're allowing your vendors to submit invoices with taxes, it will take the tax rate into account in calculating the line item tax total, and then it will calculate the line item tax total to add to the total line item to make sure that the taxes are included in the totals. So it's the same thing as the line item calculation, but it's also including the tax in its calculations. And if it doesn't calculate properly, then again the error message will be sent for a rejection or come in with a warning. The line item date before invoice date. This validates that the line item dates, each detail line item date, do not occur before the invoice date. I'm sorry, the X number of days before the invoice date. So when an invoice comes into eCounsel, it checks the invoice line item date to make sure it's less than whatever parameter number of days you set in the rule. If the line item date is X number of days before the date, then it's again going to reject or warn depending on your settings, and it'll give the message the line item number contains a date that is greater than the number of days prior to the invoice date. So if you're allowing them to bill you 90 days back, but not anything older than that, this is what that validates. So if you're saying you can bill me 90 days old, but nothing older than that, then anything they submit that's older than the 90-day period will get rejected. The line item date expired. This is when you want to be warned when an invoice has an invoice line item date that is, again, a number of days before the submission date. It works in the same fashion. It has a criteria that you can put into the parameter, and the rule validates those number of days, and if the invoice meets those days and it allows it, if not, it's going to reject it or warn. And it'll say, again, the line item date violates the number of day expiration invoice audit constraint. Line item date and service dates. This is if the line item date is before the invoice service start date or after the end date. In other words, it's out of the service date range. So it validates the detail line items against the service dates, and if it falls outside of those service dates, then it will issue the warning or reject. And it'll say the line item X contains a date that is outside the service date for this invoice. Now, no validation occurs if the amount is empty or the line item cost is empty or the discount line, there is a discount line item. It doesn't validate discount line items, and it doesn't validate if the line item date is null. Line item description contains. This is where you can validate for keywords to look for in the invoices, something like overtime or online research or something to that effect, something that you don't want to pay for, you've already told them you're not going to pay for. You can actually install this rule, and you can install it multiple times for each word that you want to look for, and it will reject or warn on those line items. Alternatively, we have the second line item description contains two. This rule works the same way, except this one uses a configuration file where you can put all your keywords in one file, and then you can just point the rule to look to that file to look for those keywords to validate against. And it does give you the same information. If it finds any of those words, then if you let it in, it's going to give you the warning that the line item description contains the following keywords, and it'll give you the keywords. Or it'll reject to them and tell them the same thing. Line item number of hours in tenths. Most clients want to be billed in tenths increments. A lot of firms bill in quarter increments, and so this is a way to validate how they're billing you and make sure that they're billing you in tenths and not quarters. So this rule will look at those hours or units that are not incremented in tenths, and if you're warning, it'll let it in with a warning message saying that the line item contains hours that are not in tenths increments, or it'll reject back to them and tell them the same thing. Mandatory timekeeper. This rule basically just validates that there is a timekeeper ID in the leads file. It doesn't validate the value, it just merely makes sure that there is a timekeeper on the line item. So if there isn't one, it just tells them that it doesn't contain a timekeeper, and they can reject or warn. The maximum expense amount. This one you can also indicate as an expense code that has a line item amount which exceeds a given amount. The parameter in the rule allows you to specify an amount that they cannot exceed, and if it does exceed that amount for the expense, then it will reject, and it will reject based on the code. So in this, you'll specify the code and the amount that you'll allow the maximum for. And then the error message will just say that the expense code, whatever number of whatever value exceeds the amount allowed. The max rate. This will warn you or reject an invoice when a line item has a rate that exceeds a set amount. Again, that is a parameter in the rule that you can set, where you can set the line item rate. And if the line item rate is null or empty, no validation is going to be made because there's nothing to look at. If the leads file line item exceeds the value in the parameter, then it's going to reject or warn. And the warning will say the rate X exceeds the allowed rate of whatever you specified. Missing billing end date. This one and the next one, the missing billing start date. These just validate to make sure that the start date and the end date for the billing service dates are not missing. Because then the other rules couldn't validate, because some of them validate based on the service dates. So these just validate on those two dates, make sure that there's something there, and if they're missing, then it's going to issue a warning or reject the invoice. Multiple billing. This is if you want to know if they're billing you multiple fee line items for a given task by different timekeepers. In other words, you have multiple timekeepers attending the same conference or the same meetings, and they're both billing you for the same time. So if you want to know about those situations, you can install this rule, and then it validates on meeting, deposition, hearing, or attend. And it'll look at the fee line item for a valid timekeeper, the line item date, and if it contains any of those words, then it's going to issue you a warning or reject the invoice saying that there's multiple billing for the same things. And the message will be more than one timekeeper is attending a meeting or hearing or deposition, whatever it is, it'll substitute that word and say more than one timekeeper is attending on this day. Multiple matters. Most clients have vendors billing one invoice, one matter. But you do have sometimes vendors that try to bill multiple matters on one invoice. And in order to keep track of that, this rule, if you install it, will validate. And it triggers when the invoice is submitted into eCounsel and counts the number of matters for each invoice. If there's more than one matter for an invoice, then it's going to either warn or reject and say that there are so many matters on this invoice. Null expense code basically just looks to see and make sure that there's an expense code for non-discount line items. It doesn't validate the value of the code, it just merely checks to make sure that there's a value there. So if there is no value, then it's going to issue a warning or reject the invoice saying that the line item is missing the expense code. Same thing with the null task code, except it validates task codes on fee line items. And if the task code is missing, it'll say the line item fee has a missing or invalid task code. The rate validation, we've kind of expanded on this one. Users have requested an invoice audit rule that compares a timekeeper first at the matter player level, and if there is no player record, then it'll validate on the employment level. We've added flexibility to this rule where you can designate whether you want to validate the rates based on them being greater than or equal to the rate in eCounsel. If you validate greater than, it's going to allow anything less than the rate that you have in eCounsel to come in. So if they want to bill you less than what you have approved, you'll allow that. But if you stay equal to, they have to bill you exactly what you agreed to. They can't bill less, they can't bill more. You can specify the matter types to validate against. So if you want to do the rate validation only on, say, the litigation matter types, but not on contracts or IP matters, you can specify that in the rule. And you specify the matter types, it'll only validate on those types of matters. You can also specify if you always want to start the validation with the player record. Sometimes vendors and clients agree on a negotiated rate for specific matters, and those negotiated rates are usually tracked in the matter player tab for the timekeeper. So normally you would probably want to start validating at the player record, and if there's nothing there, then it will go immediately to the employment record to validate. If you don't do that, then it'll always probably go directly to the employment record to validate first. You can specify certain billing methods to exclude from the rate comparison as well, and we've allowed that parameter so that it will accommodate alternative fee arrangements that you may have in place. There are some assumptions that are taken into place with this rule. It's assuming that the client is also using the mandatory timekeeper and timekeeper employment validation invoice audit rules. If the comparison starts at the player level, the timekeeper has no record, then the rule will automatically use the timekeeper's employment record to do the comparison. If the rate comparison starts at the player level and the rate field is null or 0, the rule will automatically use the timekeeper's employment record. And when specifying billing methods to exclude, the rate comparison must always start at the player record, and the billing method would be specified therein. Oh, and you can enter that rule multiple times, once for each matter type, because if you want to validate differently for the matter types, you may have alternate fee arrangements for some and not for others, and you want to validate based on those criteria, you can enter that rule multiple times for different matter types. Service dates greater than the current date. Sometimes vendors make typos in their data entry, and invoices come in saying that the dates are after the current system date. This rule validates for that, and it'll reject or warn if you let it in, saying that the service date is greater than the submission date, or the service end date is greater than the submission date. So it validates both the start and the end dates. Specified expense code. This is another rule that you can install multiple times, once for each individual expense code. And what this does is it actually matches the expense code that you configure in the rule. And it will allow it in or reject it if it's of a specific code type. So, for instance, if you're not accepting local travel ever, then you want to install this rule and specify E109, and if this rule locates that code anywhere in the bill, then it's going to reject it or let it in with a warning saying that the line item is of an expense type E109. And this is a rule you can install multiple times as well, one for each type of code. Sum of line items foot. This rule basically just does a calculation where it calculates the total of the detailed line items against the invoice total, and they must match. And if they don't match, then it's going to reject or warn, saying that there's a calculation issue where the invoice adjusted amount pre-tax doesn't equal the sum of the invoice line items. Sum of line items foot with tax is the same thing, except here they're taking taxes into consideration in the calculations as well. And you can have one or the other. You shouldn't have both installed because then they'll conflict. Excuse me. Okay, the tax code validation. This actually looks at fee line items for task codes. It says phase task code because really the task code is what it's looking for, but the task is associated to phases. And the phase is a higher level of code where then you have the detailed tasks within that phase. So if you have, say you're in discovery, that would be the phase. But the tasks within there may be answers to interrogatories or something to that effect. So a lot more detail in the task that you're actually performing. So the tasks are what's used to identify the type of services being provided. And this rule actually validates those task codes and makes sure that the task code is not empty or is correct. And in order for it to be correct, the client has to associate the task codes, or rather the phases to which those task codes belong. They have to associate those phases to the matter types in Suite Manager. If the phases are not associated to the matter types, then the task codes, even though they exist in Suite Manager and they are valid task codes, they will not be deemed as valid because they're not associated to the matter types. So that's something that you need to keep in mind whenever these task code validations are being performed. If ever vendors are saying, I'm using a correct task code, it's still rejecting it, saying it's invalid, the first thing you need to check is to make sure that that phase is associated to the matter type. If it's deemed invalid, then again, it will reject or let the invoice in with a warning saying that the line item task code of X, and it'll tell you what the code is from the lead file failed to import because it is invalid. Sometimes vendors use expense codes or activity codes as task codes, and they just need to understand that there is a difference. The timekeeper employment validation. This is the rule that validates your timekeepers as they're imported into eCounsel on the invoices. When an invoice timekeeper is not found as a valid, that they have a valid employment record, and this is for all non-discount fee line items. It only validates the non-discount fee line items. If the timekeeper is not found in eCounsel, either at the employment level, then it will reject the invoice, saying that the timekeeper doesn't exist, or it's an invalid timekeeper, or it couldn't find a valid record. So basically, you need to follow, it follows all this, the criteria here, where it says the timekeeper has to exist in eCounsel, the law firm has to exist in eCounsel, they have to be associated to each other, of course. The line item adjusted pre-tax amount has to be greater than 0. In other words, it can't be a 0 line item or it won't validate it. If those criteria are met, then the record's end date is null, or it has to be null or in the future. In other words, it has to be an active employment record. You can have a future end date as long as it's not before the date of the invoice, because it has to fall within that time period. So it has to fall within the date ranges specified on the timekeeper employment record. If an invoice comes in where they're billing you for dates prior to when you actually entered them as a timekeeper and approved them as a timekeeper, then those invoices will probably reject, unless you let them in with a warning. And of course, then it'll just tell you the timekeeper, and it'll give you the timekeeper ID from the leads file for the line item does not contain a valid employment record for the invoice vendor. If the timekeeper exists in eCounsel but is not associated to the vendor, in other words, you have the timekeeper record in the base info, but you haven't created an employment record yet to associate them to the vendor, they'll reject as well. Timekeeper max hours. This is when you're allowing a timekeeper to bill only a certain number of hours a day. In other words, you don't want them to bill 24 hours a day or 18 hours a day. Maybe if you do, it's entirely up to you. But you specify that in the parameter of this rule. And so you can say, you can specify the number of hours you will allow per day per timekeeper, and the rule will validate that. And if the timekeeper exceeds those hours in a day, then they'll get the error message that timekeeper is billing for more than the maximum hours of whatever you specify, and it'll give them the date and the number of billed hours. The valid player rule basically just validates to make sure that your timekeeper has been added to the matter as a player. This is a way that clients actually confirm that they've been approved to work on the matter. They add them as players to the matter. If they don't exist on the matter as a player, then the invoice will reject or come in with a warning. And it'll say line item X does not contain a valid player. And it'll tell you the timekeeper ID of the player in the leads file. Those are all the invoice audit rules. Now, we always recommend that you set the invoice audit rules to reject so that you don't have to triage them after they come in and try to then manually reject them and manage them that way. If you reject them automatically as they come into the system, the vendors will be notified the reason for why they were rejected, and it will be up to them to make the corrections and resubmit. Otherwise, they come into the system, you have to look at the invoice, you have to decide if you're going to reject it or not. If you reject it, then you have to instruct the vendor to resubmit it with a suffix in the invoice that it doesn't come in as a duplicate. There's different things that you would have to then manage after that. The validation rules. These are rules that kick off after the invoice has already passed the invoice audit rules and it has been allowed into the system. The invoice approval verify identity. This is when an approver is approving an invoice. It just validates that the user is the person approving. And if not, then it's not going to let them. It's going to say you are not authorized to approve this invoice. And the invoice approval record does not have an approver associated with it. So this is something that would prevent just anybody approving the invoices. The duplicates validation with a configuration file, this is basically validates invoices to check them to see if they're duplicates. There's a configuration file that gives you a listing of the invoice-based info fields that you can select to validate on, and also user profiles, IDs, user fields basically. And based on that configuration file and how you set it to validate for duplicates, it will reject the invoice or let it in with a warning. Invoice is considered a match for invoice, and it'll give you the invoice number. Invoice post must be approved. This triggers when you're posting the invoices. If the invoice is not fully approved, in other words, all the approvers have approved, but that none of them have met the criteria or have sufficient approval authority to approve the invoice, you'll get this error message that and won't let you post the invoice. So then you'll have to route it to somebody else to approve. The workflow rules. You have the invoice currency conversion rule that also triggers after the invoice comes into eCounsel. And this works with foreign currency. So if the currency type comes in that is not the base currency defined in Suite Manager, then it's going to trigger this rule. And it's going to set the preferred currency code on all invoices received for a particular vendor. And it is optional for vendors. You don't have to set the preferred currency code. But once you set it, the rule will validate that code to then determine the rate it should use to convert the currency. And the rates and codes are managed in an external file, a flat file, that you put on a path location that the rule can read. And it does convert the invoice. It comes in on the native currency, but then it uses the code to convert and the rate, and then it recalculates the invoice accordingly. Invoice reject if closed matter. This is a rule that is available to you if you want to allow invoices into the system only for a specified period of time after a matter closes. You can install this rule and then just designate the number of days to be added to the matter close date to determine if the invoice date meets the requirement. If they're billing, if you're only allowing like 30 days for them to submit all their final invoices after a matter is closed, you would set that number of days to 30 days. Anything that comes in after that 30-day period would be rejected. The invoice routing package is a standard rule that we provide. It is not the out-of-the-box routing. It works similarly, except that it uses a configuration file, and there are certain criteria that need to be followed. The configuration file will actually contain all the approval chains for the approvers. And it'll have the approver. You can specify a pre-approver. You can add additional criteria, in other words, specify matter type that they can approve on, the authority amount, and any supervisor. So if the pre-approver and the approver don't have sufficient approval authority, it'll go to their supervisor. All the parameters for this file are located in the properties file. And this is basically where you tell it what additional criteria you're going to use, the pre-approver, and so forth. So this is something that you would configure when you're installing the rule. Body of all the emails, because email notifications are sent, they're also located in text files. And all of these files have to be located on the data root directory on your server, and the rule has to be able to read that directory. It triggers on matter invoice import or when an invoice is approved. There are certain criteria that needs to be set up. There's a workflow that needs to be followed. It's very similar to the out-of-the-box, but it's a little bit more complex because you are allowed to then specify all your approvers in one file, and it reads that file. It does put invoices on hold if the approvers don't exist on the file. It does a lot of validations and checking. If any of you are interested in this, just contact the services department or the support department, and we'll be able to assist you with installing that rule if that's something you want to do. So as you can see here, it does do a lot of validations. We're down to our last 5 minutes. I'm just going to go over the tasks real quick, and then we'll be done. The Smart Invoice web task is basically the task that imports the files from Corridor and can be scheduled to run at a specific time. And these can be customized to be multiple times throughout the day or throughout the week or once a day, however you want it. It also updates the Corridor invoice status when it runs. So any invoices that have come in prior to the current run will then be updated. The statuses will be pulled to update Corridor. If invoices are deleted in eCounsel, then the task is going to be unable to update Corridor and it's going to error out. So the recommendation is to not delete invoices, always just reject them. The invoice routing task, as I had stated earlier, is the one that's going to route your invoices once this schedule runs. And it will perform a timeout. If you specify to timeout a person, you're going to give them 5 days to approve. If they don't approve within those 5 days, then it'll time them out and move it on to the next person. And what it does is it just basically populates the receive date for the approver. That's what routes it to the user, and it puts it on their homepage widget. Approver email notification task. We talked about that. This is the one that sends the email notifications with the links. And this is kind of like what the email will look like. It'll have a primary link that will, if you click on that one, it'll give you a listing of all of the invoices in the invoice module. You can click on each one individually to approve them individually if you want. The AP integration task is the one that exports all of the invoice information to an XML format and puts it in a specified directory to be imported by the client's accounts payable system. It also performs invoice payment information if the third-party accounts payable system does provide that file. And that is our invoice routing process out of the box and our standard invoice routing rules and tasks. Are there any questions?
As I say, given that we are 2 minutes to the hour, I don't see any questions right now, but if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to support@mitratech.com, or you can send an email to info or marketing@mitratech.com. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, we are recording it. We will send this out. It should be sent out probably early next week, Monday or Tuesday. But we thank you so much for joining us. And Betsy, thank you so much for going through everything. It was very much appreciated. And I know lots of people are looking forward to getting the recording so they can share it with their team members. It was a wealth of information. So thank you for taking the time to put this all together.
Happy to do so. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, guys.